Welcome, thanks for coming along. And what we're going to do for sort of just under an hour is think about sustainable development, but where are we with that, with education? We'll look a bit about where education has fitted with it in the past, the current situation, and obviously where it might be going in the future. So I'm Jon James, and I'm also, for this session, joined by Celia Tidmarsh and by Tom Henfrey as well, and they'll be chipping in as we go along. But there's going to be quite a lot of work for you to do. We want you engaged. I'm involved with science education, and particularly both Celia and I are very involved with educating our future teachers along the PGCE route. Last year, with Kate, actually, who's sitting over there, who's the history tutor, we took a number of the PGCE science student teachers and history ones, it was a joint exercise, into one of the local secondary schools in Bristol. And we ran a project for the morning about the medieval warming period, and particularly focused on Greenland. And we got them to look at some of the evidence around climate. It's a period that's used by climate change skeptics a lot as evidence that, look, these changes happen. What's happening today is no different. So we spent the morning with some it was able students, wasn't it, down there, and they were looking at sources and different information. At the end of the morning, they did a sort of plenary activity, and one of the questions they sort of had was, well, as a result of what you've heard this morning and what you've looked at, where does it leave you in your thinking? Would you consider going away now and acting on what you've heard? And if so, what sort of action might you take? And they produced some display work on this. What I've done is collated off those displays about 15 comments that were made, and they're fairly representative. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to give you one of these, pair up with somebody, have a quick look through them, and just have a think about what sort of messages are, these were 14-year-olds, and I think that they reflect well, I've got children myself of that sort of age, the sort of way children are thinking about these issues. So, one of these each, and we'll give you a few minutes to have a look at them. Do move. We want you talking. That's the key thing now. You're not in here to sit on your own. Okay, thanks. Now, those things that have come out from that, we'll pick up. We're going to sort of share some ideas with you, really. And I think you'll see that a lot of what we share is picked up in those actual comments. I'm going to start by putting up 1974, that was written by Schumacher, and all we've done 30 odd years on is added a lot more education and a lot more pollution. And we do today want to raise questions about education's role in this, and we might possibly be saying, education today, is it making the situation worse, possibly? The sort of education we're presenting and we've got, but we'll have a look at that. So that's an interesting that correlation or lack of correlation there. That lots of education, high quality education, doesn't seem then to equate to sustainable behaviour. And in fact, there may be a bigger correlation to the kind of growth economy model, and you could argue our school system is sort of built into that. We thought we'd just present to you the sort of current model of learning, really, that we've got in this country, and Celia's going to chip in as well with this. It's largely, and it's picked up in those comments. Do you like the comment about exams? Yeah, that. And that's our current model. It's cognitive learning. That's what we've got. And I've said with a little values education thrown in. So it's kind of, if you look at curriculum documents, values are sort of bolted. And we see this in teacher education where teachers have to meet a set of standards now, and there's an additional standard which is called British, something about they have to uphold British values, and it's kind of bolted on as this, you know, it's cognitive standards. We'll throw this in as well, and the model really I've presented as a triangle here is that. So we've got a curriculum, that's what we teach in schools. We've got pedagogy, and Celia and I work a lot with our students on, you know, how do we teach it, what seems the most effective way, and then we've got assessment, finding out what's actually been learned, and you know that's the model that we've got in place. We'll move on in a few minutes to think about a sort of much more transformative model rather than this cognitive model. Celia, do you want to chip in with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think within that model, there's curriculum is one of the influences or one of the factors. And that's problematic in itself, because as this slide sums up, the most beneficial way of approaching environmental issues and the whole thing about sustainable development is through subjects coming together and working in an interdisciplinary way, in a holistic way. But actually what you've got in schools is, you know, a curriculum that is divided down subject lines. So it's really very difficult for subjects to kind of get together. So the sort of project that Jon described that he did with Kate isn't something which is terribly common in schools. In some it probably doesn't happen at all, or it's, you know, it's a kind of special event which is run by people coming from outside to do. And that isn't because teachers in schools aren't concerned to do it, it's just that they don't have the scope, they don't get the space, because so much is being driven by exam results.
Yeah. And interestingly, and Kate, do chip in if you've got a view on this, that project we did threw up some real tensions between the science student teachers and the history student teachers. So working together was just about all right, but there were some real issues about values that came up. And so, for example, the science students went home from the morning quite uncomfortable that they'd felt they'd not got a message across. They were very concerned about global warming and that children, you know, realised the potential impact of it, and they left the morning uncomfortable. Whereas I think the history students, would you say, were more open? They were much more open. One could argue sitting on the fence in terms of the debate, happy they'd got across different points of view, and that was, you know, that's highlighted this perhaps, well, lack of working together and the tensions around it. Yeah. And you see that, don't you, in the comment that one of them made about history's got this view, science has got this view, so what do I believe? That's that type of thinking, isn't it? So yeah, to do this bit now, it might be interesting, I'm sure some of you are aware, we've got a new national curriculum coming, and that comes into force in a year's time. And so we just thought we'd present, I don't want to colour it, but a slightly depressing nature of this new national curriculum. If you look through it for references to the environment, to sustainability, to climate change, to areas like that, well, you're going to have to look very hard. And I've put up that's it in terms of some science statements. So we've got about the efficacy of recycling. There's something about impact on climate. And there's something in Key Stage 4 citizenship, but fairly oblique. You'd have to work quite hard to bring ideas into that. That is it in the compulsory national curriculum. So Celia's subject geography.
It tends to be statements about patterns and processes of human and physical features and so on. And there is scope there for committed teachers to bring in what they want. So that's the positive side. And I don't feel that environmental issues and sustainable development are going to disappear out of schools because of this. But certainly this is not encouraging it to happen, which I guess is the difference. We go back to the previous version of the national curriculum, there was very explicit recognition that ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, should be in there. But even then, it still wasn't done a great deal. So actually, maybe the policy documents don't have a lot of influence anyway.
Yeah.
You know, that's a question, perhaps.
It is. I think that is a question. is maybe there's better no mention than possibly this sort of mention, where the focus is just cognitive learning. And if that's all it is, and then people having those feelings, as was highlighted over here, of despair and the problem's too big, that might be more of a problem. Just one example, as Celia was saying, individual teachers can often build on these things, and one example there is from GCSE Design and Technology, and I know my own daughter is doing textiles under that umbrella, and in their projects they do quite a lot about where is the clothing being sourced from, who is the market for this, and they do think about sustainable issues. So, but I think it's certainly in her case, it's her teacher's got a passion for that and really got them thinking about it. So there is scope, and there sometimes are some encouraging signs. Celia, you're going to mention this,
yeah,
aren't you?
I mean, I think having tried to be kind of positive about it, there are some things here that kind of contradict our optimism, perhaps, in that this was a study done, back in 2006, things have changed, but nothing significant has happened to tackle the issues that these student teachers are raising about what they find difficult about tackling sustainable development and environmental issues in the classroom. And having had Jon's sheet of the pupils and quotes from them, it's quite interesting to see that there's some things that are coming up here that the student teachers are recognising as problematic. Third one down, being hypocritical in our teaching, in that our teaching and lifestyles may not be compatible. There's that quote there. I bet they drove here. So kids are quick to pick up where there's a contradiction between what's said and what's actually done. The sense of fairness is very strong in the minds of teenagers. So that there's connections there. So these were people who were training, who were on their PGCE course, who were being asked about, they were geography trainees. They knew that within the curriculum there were opportunities to do things about the environment, but these were their doubts. These were the issues that they saw that were going to be problematic for them. Not to say they didn't see ways of overcoming them, but partly it's also going into schools and learning from established teachers. And if there isn't good practice within the schools, they're not going to be encouraged to think about ways of tackling these challenges.
One of the questions we ask at our interviews now for PGCE is what approach they would take to teaching issues such as this. And we outline the scenario of what would your position be? Would you sit on the fence? Would you play devil's advocate when teaching issues like this? Or would you actually play advocate? And we get them to think around that. And that's important, because as working on educating teachers, it's thinking about your own values and your own identity you're going to present in the classroom.
I think this is one more quote from that paper, which in a way I think captures some of the sort of real basics about education. Is it about reproducing what we've already got, or is it about challenging what we've got? And, you could criticise perhaps this person for not being brave, but I think it's easier to do the first. That's the practicality. When you're learning to be a teacher, there are so many things to be taking on. If you're faced with the prospect that you're taking on societal norms and values, you're going to take the easy route.
Okay, so what I'm presenting here is a kind of different model for us to think about, and both Celia and Tom are going to sort of build on that. But so it's going really beyond the cognitive. It's not eliminating the cognitive, because if you're going to identify with these issues, you need the knowledge. But it's then going further, and in particular, this existential dimension. What we mean by that is the sort of values and the identity. Can you truly sign up to it? And there, as we see in some of those comments, these issues of peer pressure come in. And the last one, isn't it, about, this is for hippies. I am concerned. I know it's a problem, but it doesn't really identify with me. And so, if you're going to move on and think about action, that's a really important one to get across. And then you've kind of got to feel empowered about it. And many of those statements lack that empowerment. Despair, hopelessness, or it's the government. You need that sort of level of activity. And what this model is saying is, if we want action, if we want lifestyle change, that we need to have a system that promotes these dimensions, and this guy Hicks is very sort of promotes this model.
Can I just link back to that quote with the big one about I take the easier route. I mean, I think in a way, the end one of here, the action dimension, that in a way is the scary bit. The teachers doing a lesson and then their kids are going out and protesting somewhere. That is not going to be something that they're going to be judged very well on in terms of their school and their own career. So there's lots of pressures on teachers to only go so far down this model.
The rest of our time together, we're very much using that approach, and it's commonly, there's a guy, which Celia and Tom might mention more, a guy called Sterling, who uses this type of model. We've got education about, for, and ultimately as sustainable development. Everything we've presented so far about the national curriculum, the cognitive learning model we've got are very much focused on number one. Celia's going to say a bit more about 1 and 2, and then Tom's going to come in and say something about 3.
We were having a little debate between the three of us about where this kind of model came from, the about, the for, the as. And certainly the little book by Stephen Sterling here was very significant in developing that approach. Published first in 2001, has been reprinted several times, and most recently 2011. So clearly has a lot to say and people want to hear it. But if we have a look and see, well, first of all, I'd like to just read a description. Can we go back to that description about each of those to be clear what we mean by each of them? And I'm taking a description from an amazing publication, actually. It came from 2003, published by Bristol City Council. It came out of what was called their Educational Sustainable Development Strategy Group. I don't know whether it still exists. I suspect not, but be good to hear if it does. And they've based this is what was going out to schools, and they've based learning process in education for sustainable development, one of the key appendix that came with the booklet, on Stephen Sterling's work. Education about sustainability or sustainable development. Of course, there's a big debate around whether you use sustainable development or sustainability, which I don't think we're going to get into today, are we? Characterised by providing information, but not questioning current systems and values. Okay, so that's the one at the top. You can see that there are links with the previous learning model that Jon's just talked through. Education for sustainable development. This goes beyond content to include reflection on values and skills development, although it still assumes that we know what is required and therefore current systems are not transformed. And And I think that, again, that links back to John's very first slide, was it, where you said, or second slide about education having a lot of content with some values. So education for sustainability, some values within. Education as sustainable development. Included here are content and values, but a much greater emphasis is placed on deeper process and quality of learning. Learning is creative, reflective, and participatory. Learning and sustainability are reflected in each other. Ambiguity and uncertainty are sought, and deep values challenged. What I would argue is that that doesn't happen in schools, except perhaps in very rare cases. Certainly, and I'm going to pass on to Tom in a minute to kind of deal with that one and present us with some hope about where it can happen. What we have in schools, as a geography PGCE tutor, I go in and observe a lot of lessons. I'm involved in curriculum, thinking about the curriculum. And there are certain topics that I see time and time again. There's a small number that get taught. And they are represented here by the images. There's recycling, fair trade, rainforest, destruction, deforestation. Toilet roll isn't perhaps what might first come into your mind. It's about the fact that Sainsbury's, I think it was, made the inner tube smaller so they could transport more of them in one go. I don't know if you picked up on that piece of news. It was about 6 months or a year ago. Now, the reason why those are chosen are because they can be simplified and they can be made concrete rather than abstract. That was something that one of the student teachers came up with and saying, you know, the problem is it's too abstract. Got to make it kind of mean something on a day-to-day level. You can do that with all of these. They have a clear, or at least certainly 2 of them have very clear action outcomes, or appearingly clear action outcomes. You know, you can recycle, you can buy fair trade. Of course, what they don't do is problematize any of this. So if we take fair trade, for example, there's a lot of questions about whether fair trade is good or not. You don't hear that in many geography classrooms, I'm afraid. And again, I don't want to sound critical of teachers. There are lots of reasons why they don't do it, which are really good reasons and solid, sound reasons. They are making decisions based on the pressures that are on them. So I certainly am not wanting to be suggesting that I'm criticising. I'm describing, you know, what it is that happens in classrooms. Rainforest destruction, okay, yeah, it's happening, there are issues with it, but what about the fact that we've already got rid of all of our forests? You know, that rarely gets put into the frame. We've already deforested our country, thank you very much. We're now looking at you and criticising you for doing the same. That doesn't get raised. Recycling, another one. Yeah, it's a really nice thing people can go home and do. Schools can do it. Schools make quite a big thing about recycling. The issues about what happens when it leaves you to go and be processed is very rarely looked at. So I would argue that these certainly would tick the box of education about sustainable development, and possibly, if handled well, might very well move into education for sustainable development. There may be some values, there may be some questioning, but I would argue it goes nowhere near to this third option for the reasons, some of which I've mentioned, you know, the exam pressure, the pressure to cover the content, to produce the exam results, and there being no sort of career progression points awarded for your kids getting really uptight and writing letters of protest or taking to the streets. Okay, Tom, over to you.
Okay. I'd like to start by looking at this in broader perspective, and to me, Sterling's model of these 3 levels of attention to sustainability in education, and the importance of a transformative approach reflects broader trends in sustainability thinking more generally that are based on a recognition that the lack of sustainability is something that's systemic and it's entrenched, and it's something that's evidence has come to light recently shown that is inherent in systems that are built on growth as a necessary structural feature of an economy and consumption as a driver for that, and the driver that's reinforced both by a need for ever-increasing levels of consumption to satisfy material needs, but also culturally, to the extent that our identities, our social roles are in so many ways based on our patterns of consumption, our relationships with things and with activities that are all consumption based. And that leaves very little scope for individual action to make meaningful changes to this pattern. It's also led to sustainability contradicting most of the basic cultural premises of our society. Over several hundred years of economic growth, we've now got worldviews and individual mindsets which reflect this implicit assumption in society that we can continue to consume and use more and more, and that the environment will always find ways to absorb that, or we'll come up with technological solutions that will help us to avoid the consequences. And this is a key source of the intransigence that we experience in our educational institutions. Our schools and our universities reflect that at a very deep level, a very deep and systemic level. It's not just true of education, it's true of our systems for production, our financial institutions, our institutions for training and business. And I think that has two key lessons for educationalists. One, the key role of education as one of the areas where these mindsets and the values behind them are perpetuated, certainly not the only area. And it puts into perspective the frustration we experience. When Jon and Celia and I were preparing for this, our conclusion when we looked at the material available was that it feels like a bit of a dismal picture. We all try to do what we can. We're all strongly aware of the need for sustainability, but it seems like the actions we can actually take are very small, they're quite inconsequential, and whatever we do, it always seems that broader systemic pressures, so however much we try to change this trend that was identified in Schumacher's quote from 1974, has only trended towards increasing destruction, increasing erosion of environmental and social values. That's just accelerated, even despite the extent to which awareness of sustainability, knowledge about sustainability has become commonplace in the 4 decades since. And while that's frustrating, it can also be a great source of inspiration, because it shows, well, if our efforts in these areas are so futile, if we look at Sterling's model, then we can see a reason for that, and we can see that, well, the sort of end-of-pipe solutions, the sort of adding sustainability content into curricula through education about sustainability, even teaching and transmitting skills and knowledge about sustainability to the extent that we can reach the second level, are always going to be insufficient against that background. And it's only by really taking on board the need for transformation in all of our systems, transformation in education, and the role of education as a driver of that transformation elsewhere, could we really aspire to the change that we can undertake being meaningful. And that allows us to reconceptualize and refocus our efforts and say, well, what can we do and how can we make the actions that are open to us as meaningful and as rewarding to ourselves as possible. My take on this comes from my deep hands-on involvement in various movements for community scale action on sustainability. I was down on the bill as someone from the transition education movement, which doesn't exist as such, but I do a lot of work within and with it and on behalf of Transition, which is a global network of community-led responses, initially to climate change and peak oil, but more recently has taken a deeper focus on economic regeneration and reorganising our economies so that they embody and instantiate values of sustainability and social justice. And the focus on community is one that takes the middle ground between the limits of what you can do as an individual and the intransigence of our dominant institutions and the fact that governments and big business seem very unwilling to take action of the depth necessary, at the timescale necessary. And transition and movements like that are about accepting those limitations and the despair that can arise from them, but not using it, not getting frustrated by it, realising that the need for profound change, again, of the type that's transformative and in education is suggested by education as sustainability, taking that need for change as an opportunity for change and realising that if we take responsibility for that change, we have the opportunity to shape that change in the way we want it. And at the core of transition is the creation of a positive vision of the future that we want, taking into account the scale of the global issues we're facing and the need for a profound change of direction in society, and coming up with realistic, achievable steps that we can undertake ourselves and as communities, within communities of place, within communities of practice, or as professional communities to make that happen. And some great examples are renewable energy co-ops, for example. So taking on board the need to shift to a more sustainable basis in our energy production by adopting renewable technologies, but at the same time transforming the ownership model to more democratic structures whereby anybody who's a user of energy can buy in to the organisation that's owning it and have a say as to the decisions it makes as to how energy is produced, how it's allocated. So we don't just shift the way the technical means of producing energy, we shift the whole social context from one where a very small number of companies make the decisions that restrict our choices about our relationship with energy, and we're empowered as communities of co-producers to take control of the implications of our energy use and take responsibility. In education, and particularly in school-based education, which I understand is the main interest of most of the people here, that agenda is very poorly developed. And looking around for examples, I was struck by how very marginal they are, and I think this reflects the types of constraints that Celia and Jon were referring to, the professional pressures that teachers are under and the difficulties in moving beyond that, which makes the examples of people who are bucking the trend all the more laudable. And all the more praiseworthy for me. But so what I'd like to, and I've noticed that the examples I saw were very marginal. They're outside the educational system in very fringe movements like forest schools, like Steiner education, which may have limited relevance to the realities of a professional educator working within the system. So I'd like to suggest, is it the next slide? Yeah. Is that we take the opportunity here to start to set the agenda, to take responsibility, and the invitation is for you to get back into the groups you were in at the start, or different groups if you prefer. I see a few people have joined us, and we've suggested a few key areas in which you might want to explore how education might help to equip children and young people to prepare for a future in which these things of necessity are done very differently. And it may be blue skies, big picture changes. It may be the small immediate steps you might be able to take around the areas of flexibility that your professional demands allow you. So we've got a little bit of time for that, so I'd like to gather together as you were before, or move around if that's easier. And so looks like all of you could carry on talking a bit longer, but just so everybody's got time to feed back to the room before we close, it would wind up. So if we could go around each group in turn and just get any comments you'd like to raise, if you've got any questions for myself or John or Celia. Anybody want to volunteer? Over there.
What I just like to say about you saying that... Just you were saying about how the art of protest is actually not encouraged, would be frowned upon. I'm an English teacher, and with one class just this year, we've written to Charlotte Leslie, the MP, and David Cameron. Charlotte Leslie, we were saying, please ban all non-fair trade products. David Cameron, we were saying, please stop the nuclear submarine programme and spend all the money on water aid. And that was great and was deeply encouraged by the school because they were writing formal letters using formal language and persuasive language. So it ticked all our national curriculum boxes. So actually maybe I think there are ways to get that protest in there. And you could do that in MFL. You could write in a different language to, other politicians.
And it's good persuasive writing as well.
Exactly.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think, but it still is down to individuals to be able to be committed and, wanting to do that. And you'd already declared yourself as somebody who, as a teenager, you were going to change the world, which is fantastic. I wish we had more people like you applying to do geography, but not everybody does. And that doesn't make them bad geography teachers, but they may not recognise the opportunities, as you clearly do.
Well, thank you. Don't worry, we've got Steve Murray at our school, we're fine.
And some might still argue that writing letters is perhaps still action at a distance. Is it perhaps a bolt on? Yeah.
Anybody who... Anybody else? Couldn't wait for a mic.
One of the things our group was talking about was the issue, we started off talking about transport in particular, that for a lot of pupils in the context of the lives that they lead, they don't see that there is an alternative. I teach out in the countryside in Monmouth, and we have the pupils that live in town, walk to school, cycle to school, because it's a 15-minute journey. So for them, they're already doing their bit for sustainable development as far as transport is concerned. What more do they need to do? The others that live on farms or that commute in from Hereford have no choice but to take the car because there isn't much of a public transport system running there because it is in Wales, in the countryside, in the valley, surrounded by farmland. And the same would go for things like food. And we moved on from there to talking about clothing and the way that it's kind of come out of the development of the Western world as it is at the moment, that there is this lifestyle that we lead where we expect to have particular things, energy whenever we switch on a light bulb, we expect to have cheap housing for everybody. And there's not really this connection in children's minds that in order to get that clothing at that cheap rate, it must have been produced in Southeast Asia, possibly using child labour. They're not considering any of this at all. I mean, one more point that I would like to make is that the school that I work in, we have something called the integrated curriculum, and I don't know if any other schools do this. You're familiar with it, I know. Where we spend a certain amount of time each week drawing together all of the skills from all of the other subjects to work on projects that would include something like sustainability and sustainable development and kind of citizenship, those sorts of things about the wider context in which the children live. And we're actually finding it's quite successful in preventing children thinking so much about the subject as just being a way of jumping through a hoop to get a qualification, to get a job. And it's more about learning the skills that are involved in all of these subjects and bringing them all together. So you were saying about using the English lesson to write to David Cameron, just in science. We have written letters to David Cameron about sustainable energy. But in teaching about sustainable energy, we've also brought in aspects of geography and history and a little bit of politics to try and bring all of that together. And I think that's quite a good way to go. I don't know what other people think. It remains to be seen how successful it will be.
I'm intrigued to hear how many letters David Cameron must be getting. It'd be nice to know what he does with them, wouldn't it?
Recycles them.
After reading them, hopefully. And that's sounds like a really great and constructive approach, again, a way of taking advantage of the opportunities the programme does provide. I wondered whether there's any scope for you to link it up, like for example, could one of the problems that you encourage the pupils to apply their knowledge across subjects to, whether that could be transportation, reflecting on what the things that constrain people to car transport, if there are measures that could be taken, things they could do themselves, things to lobby government about. That could be the subject of the next letter to David Cameron. Thanks for sharing that.
I think as well, when I'd started teaching, which was a long time ago, I remember one of the first things my head teacher said to me, he said, "John, you've got to remember that what you say in your lessons today will be the subject at tea tables tonight." And one of those pupil comments picks that, I'll go home and chat to my family, and I think that's important in thinking about some transformation, is that sense of them going away and being so inspired and captivated by it that they act like that.